Jill Martucci, and I'm a principal here at the Bonadio Group on the Information Risk Management team, and I lead our HITRUST service offering. You're joining today to learn a little bit more about HITRUST and the HITRUST CSF security and privacy framework, which has been gaining popularity across many industries, not just in healthcare, and we're happy to have you here. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Allison Hall, a manager on the team, and she helps lead a number of our HITRUST engagements. And she'll be adding some context later in the presentation. And we're both very pleased to have Mike Parisi join us as well. And Mike is the Vice President of Assurance Strategy and Community Development at HITRUST. So with the panel we have today, we will be able to share information both from the consulting and assessor firm point of view, which is what Bonadio offers, and likewise have insights directly from the HITRUST organization itself with Mike's involvement. So let me go over what we will be talking on today. We will start with an overview of the HITRUST organization and the HITRUST CSF security and privacy framework. And then we're going to jump into some of the details around the assessments, including the types, the scoping of an assessment, and the next steps and timeline considerations, as well as a few upcoming changes with the next release that you can expect as well. As some of you may already know, depending on where you are in your HITRUST journey, HITRUST can be very detailed as far as knowledge base, and there is a lot to learn, but today the purpose of this call is to stay more high level and start with mainly that foundational information. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Mike, and he's going to get us started with some background information on the HITRUST organization and the framework.
Great, thanks, Jill. And you're going to be advancing the slides, is that right? Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
So, thank you to Jill and Allison, the entire NEO group for welcoming me here today. I'm excited to have the conversation, and you guys are a longstanding partner of ours, so I really appreciate the opportunity to present along with you and answer any questions that the audience may have. And we're going to talk about the different roles, as Jill mentioned, as we go through. I think a lot of times there might be some questions or confusion around, well, what does HITRUST do versus the assessor organization versus management? As Jill mentioned, there's a lot of moving parts, right, that we need to understand in order to ensure we are pursuing this effectively together as a team. So think of us as a team, right? We're all working together through this process, and we're going to talk about all the different areas that you need to think about at a high level as we go through this today. Let's start with HITRUST, and I see that we've got a number of individuals and organizations joining us for the discussion today, recognizing that your familiarity with HITRUST may be all over the map, right? We may have some folks joining us that need the one-on-one from a program perspective. We may have some that are in process with doing something already relative to the programs, and we may have some folks that are well experienced, right? They're continuing to feed and nurture what they've done from a HITRUST perspective over a period of time. So I think we'll kind of frame our discussion to address all those different buckets, as you can see in some of the points that we set up in the agenda today. So HITRUST, for those that aren't familiar, HITRUST is an internationally recognized enterprise risk management standards organization, right? So at our core, what we strive to do for every organization across every industry, as Jill mentioned before, and internationally, is to make this concept of quote-unquote compliance easier for organizations, right? To make it more efficient and more effective. You're going to hear us use the term a lot, assess once and report many, right? And the ideal situation that we want to be in from an organizational perspective is to look across all these different compliance-related activities that we have, and how do we streamline that? Because it takes so much time and so much effort, oftentimes across organizations. These different types of initiatives are happening in silos. And we find, and I think if you talk to Jill and Allison, they tell you the same thing, that there's a lot of duplication and repetition that's happening within their clients and their organization. and a lot of crossover. So there's many opportunities where it's ripe to make this more efficient and more effective, which is what we are striving to do through our programs. HITRUST has a number of programs that are in place that organizations can leverage for many, many different ways. I usually put organizations in either one of two buckets. We have what we refer to as our adopters, right? So those would be organizations that are leveraging things such as the CSF framework, the threat catalog, the third-party risk management methodology and program, and to help manage their own information security and privacy programs. Then we have those organizations that are, quote-unquote, assessed entities, right? So that means organizations that may have their own things in place already from an information security and privacy perspective. Maybe they're using something like NIST or ISO or a series of other programs that exist out there, and they want to provide assurances over the HITRUST standard itself from a CSF perspective. And as we talk about the framework, the fact that all those different authoritative sources are included within that framework, it makes it easy for them to pivot and provide assurances over HITRUST from a standard perspective and ultimately, hopefully, achieve a certification and provide that to their stakeholders. Now, some organizations do both, right? They are adopters and they also assess against the framework for either their internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, but you certainly don't need to do both. As I think Joel and Allison would tell you, some organizations just need to get the assessment because they have stakeholders that are asking them for it, or because they recognize that it breaks down barriers to entry, or it could be a differentiator within the marketplace. It does not mean you need to rip out what you've already done from an information security and privacy program perspective. The way that we've designed this is that you can leverage what you've already done from an organizational perspective. So that's one thing I want to make sure we stay out of the gates. So a few things that you notice that we pose as questions here around a number of challenges that organizations are facing. I think the first one, are we addressing applicable state, federal, international regulations? When you look at our framework, which is the CSF, is what we refer to, there's a comprehensive yet scalable framework. It has over 46 different, what we refer to as authoritative sources included within there. That translates to almost 2,000 control requirements that organizations will tailor or pick and choose from associated with those authoritative sources. So first off, don't get nervous. Just because there's 2,000 things in the framework doesn't mean you got to do 2,000 things. As a matter of fact, there isn't one organization that's doing that. I mean, it's actually just a subset of those requirements that organizations would need to assess against, or if they're looking to adopt and implement. But those authoritative sources, I think it's appropriate to note what those are. And I put them into three different buckets. And so one would be other control frameworks, so things that I mentioned before, or reporting standards, right? So things such as NIST, right? A series of NIST, whether it's 853, 171, cybersecurity framework, ISO, naturally 27001, 27002, COBIT, COSO, you name it, right? We have this mentality of having an open arms approach. We don't believe in a religious debate that it should be one standard over another. We incorporate all that, recognizing that many organizations have to provide assurances over multiple different types of control frameworks, right? From a reporting framework perspective, good example there, SOC 2. So when you look at, some of the principles that are included within the framework 100% from a reporting perspective, it allows organizations to do an assessment against just the CSF and pivot and produce the different types of reports that they need to produce. That's one category. Second category would be naturally regulations. Those would be, as we have listed here, international, federal, and statutory. So things such as GDPR, APEC cross-border protection. From a federal perspective, probably the one that resonates the most, since we don't have a federal privacy law yet, would be HIPAA, right? And then also from a statutory standpoint would be things like CCPA, MA201, Nevada encryption, et cetera. The third bucket would be other standards. Those would be things like PCI, FedRAMP, FISMA, some of the other things that we've been working on from a mapping perspective as well. So all that stuff is in the framework. And what it does is it allows organizations to, again, perform one assessment against that framework and provide comfort over any and all of those different authoritative sources, depending upon how you scope. Scope is king, like anything, which Joe and Allison will take us through and talk to you about some of the things that you need to consider there. But we're really trying to drive this concept of efficiency and effectiveness across the organization relative to leveraging the framework, the assessment methodology, and insurance program. So, Joe, if you can go to the next slide for a second. Okay, great, thanks. I mentioned, who we are today, and I covered off on a number of these points here, but let me take you down maybe memory lane for a second, because I think it will help frame the remainder of the discussion and some of the things that Jill teed up in the beginning. HITRUST was born in healthcare. I think there's still this perception out there that it's only for healthcare, and it's absolutely not true. Although it did start in healthcare and started with a number of large covered entities, health plans, hospital systems, also some business associates coming together to say, this compliance stuff is broken, right? It's hard, it's expensive, it's duplicative. How do we make it easier? And when you think about it through their lens, what they were dealing with is what we're still dealing with in today's day and age, is how do we reduce the cost of care delivery? And when they looked at what was adding to the cost of care delivery across the ecosystem, compliance was a huge one. And they sought out to say, if we can make this more efficient and more effective, not only is it going to make our lives easier, it's going to make our stakeholders' lives easier, right? So those that are relying upon appropriate security and privacy posture and programs to be in place, like not only regulators, but of course our customers, right? And it's going to help us ultimately reduce the cost of care delivery. So that was the vision. And from there, we sought out to create, again, a comprehensive, scalable framework, all driven off of risk. As we know, before we can determine what types of controls or standards we need to implement within our organization, we've got to understand our risk profile. I think what a lot of organizations do, and sometimes where they stumble, is they need some type of standard or framework to put in place to support their information security and privacy program. So what do? They shop around, right? They talk to their friends, they talk to other organizations. Well, Joel, what are you using? Wow, so what are you using? And then they pick something off the shelf and say, we're going to be in this shop, or we're going to be an ISO shop. And they try and shoehorn that into the organization before they even understand what their risk profile is. So when they get several months or years down the line, they realize it may not be a one-for-one. And they also realize that, well, just because we went with one standard, now there's all these other standards that we need to provide assurances over. So they end up adding things on top of what they've already done, which adds to the costs, and it adds to the difficulty of maintaining all those programs over a period of time. So when you think about the things that we champion, not only are we trying to provide the closest thing to a silver bullet that we can relative to the framework and relative to be able to assess once the report ready, but we maintain it for you. I think that's really key. We have millions and millions of dollars in R&D within our non-for-profit side of the house that's focused on maintaining this framework. So when you think about every time a new regulation comes out, or every time there's an update to an underlying regulation or a framework or a standard, the amount of cycles that organizations spend on that internally to update their own programs is significant. So one of the main value proposition aspects that we bring to the marketplace is we do all those updates for you, whether it's a change in an underlying standard that we already have, incorporating new standards, normalizing or harmonizing additional standards that exist within the marketplace. We do the maintenance, which of course means there are a series of different versions and releases that come out associated with the framework. Sometimes that creates a little pain, right, within the industry, but it's really trying to understand what are the changes in those versions, because oftentimes a change in a version is adding an additional authoritative source that may not be relevant to you. When you think about some of the things we'll get to a little bit later on, some of the major changes we're making in our new major release, which will come at the beginning of next year, a lot of that's actually adding new regulations and standards within APAC, right? So Singapore, and then also South America, Brazil, et cetera. So if those things aren't applicable to you, you don't need to freak out. It doesn't mean that there's additional things that you're going to need to do in order to upgrade to the new standard. When you think about where this is accepted, a couple things to note. It's not just the framework. The assessment methodology is really what sets HITRUST assessments apart from other third-party assurance assessments that exist within the marketplace. Organizations can't assess themselves in any which way they choose. We have a defined assessment methodology that is rooted in and supported by foundational requirements of nature, timing, and extent of testing. Right? Those familiar with AICPA standards and years of audit experience, those terms would ring true. And when you look at our requirements and our standards, they align to the AICPA guidelines, right, by design, because we feel as if that those are the most stringent and applicable guidelines in order to support a valid assessment, right? In addition to that, we have an assurance program that sits on top of our assessment methodology, which is what Allison and Jill participate in through Bonadio. And that assurance program requires you to engage an independent third-party assessor, for which these guys are, and they are approved and vetted by HITRUST. So not everyone can be a HITRUST assessor, either as an organization or as individuals that we refer to as CCSFPs. There are a number that you can choose from. The list is available on our website, but know that they are vetted through our training, through our quality assurance program, and Jill and Allison will tell you we're not easy on these guys by design. And we review 100% of everything that they do because we are trying to instill the highest level of reliability and quality in our assessments. So when you pick up a HITRUST assessment, a validated assessment, a certification, it's got the highest level of reliability. Right? You could place reliability on that in place of doing your own proprietary procedures or sending out 400 information security questionnaires or performing on-site audits. Makes no sense. Doesn't make sense for us as the customer in having to maintain a program like that. And it certainly doesn't make sense for our business partners and our third parties that are having to respond to all of these proprietary information security questionnaires. So we see it as a call to action. Right? How do we come together as an ecosystem, as a group of vendors and third parties, and also as customers? And remember, many of us are probably wearing those two different hats. We're a customer, but we're also a third party. And how do we streamline the process to provide the highest level of assurance and transparency into security and privacy posture to our stakeholders? So everything that we do in our programs is focused on that. So Jill, if you can move to the next one, please. Okay, and then the next one. So I mentioned some of this around the framework before. The framework is publicly available on our website for quote-unquote qualified entities. What that really means is anyone can have access to it unless you are a consulting company that's trying to make money off of the IP. In that instance, you need to be one of our approved partners like Jill and Allison are. But anyone else has access to it. You'll see as part of the framework itself, not only are you going to get a comprehensive cross-reference and mapping to all the different authoritative sources that exist within there, but you're also going to get access to some of our other programs, such as our threat catalog that sits in front of the framework itself to give you a tool set to work through what threats might be applicable to your organization. How does that further link to risks and then further link to controls that you can implement in order to address those specific threats? They are very prescriptive controls. Something else that I think sets us apart or differentiates us from some of the other standards by design is we've looked across these other standards that exist within the marketplace, and I'll use NIST as an example for a second. NIST has done, obviously, tremendous work, right, over the last several years, and we recognize that, which is why it's incorporated within our framework and a lot of our methodology, especially from a risk perspective. But by design, NIST is not overly prescriptive, right? So if I were to ask everyone joining us for the discussion today, if we were all NIST shops, if you will, right, we're leveraging NIST, that would look different for each and every one of us, I would bet you, right, by design, because NIST wants you to identify what controls are appropriate and applicable to you in order to meet the requirements and the standards. So what we've sought out to do is to provide that level of prescription that exists to say, okay, if you're scratching your head around, well, I don't know what controls are the best ones that can help me solve for this particular requirement or standard, we have that within our framework. There's also this concept of implementation procedures and specifications, which gives you even further guidance around what are the sub-steps, if you will, that you need to take or that you can take in order to achieve some of those requirements within the framework. So it's giving you a roadmap in terms of things that you can consider within your own organization. And then you could work with your partners, right, like Jill and Allison, to walk through and provide you some professional services guidance around where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, right? Of course, maybe some options are automation or additional tool sets that you can procure for the organization. It might be too expensive, and that may take too long. So let's look at some other options of things that you can do. The entire framework itself and the entire assessment methodology, as we have on the slide here, follows a risk-based approach. Everything starts with a risk assessment. When you think about 2,000 different requirements that are included within there, well, how do I know which ones are applicable and not applicable? And what level do I need to achieve associated with all of those? That's the upfront process of building the risk analysis against your organization, giving you a risk profile, and then the program will tell you which out of those 2,000 requirements are applicable to your organization in order to provide assurances over. We facilitate all of that through what I refer to as our enterprise risk management platform, which is the MyCSF platform. That helps you with all the scoping, collection of evidence. It actually facilitates the assessment process, allows you the ability to do a number of different readiness reviews or self-assessments, play around with scoping, right? So if I include these systems in these locations, what's that going to look like from a level of effort perspective? If I dial it back, what's that going to look like? If I select GDPR, oh my gosh, that's going to add 300 new requirements, right? So it's different things that you can do. Other things that organizations do with that is to help them in potential business changes or even M&A related activity, right? So let's say I'm looking to acquire an organization that is EU-based, and today I'm not subject to GDPR. And if I make that acquisition, I know I'm going to be. So what does that do, right, to my level of effort? So there's a lot of functionality that's available through the platform. It is not required for you to undergo an assessment. That's important, because a lot of times there may be questions or feedback, say, quote unquote, HITRUST is expensive, there's a lot of fees associated with it. That is not a required platform. You can perform an assessment without a subscription to the platform. It is there available to organizations to leverage to the extent that they'd like to. There's obviously a lot of functionality and a lot of value that organizations see in it, but it is not required. Just wanted to set that out as part of the messaging as well. Joe, if you can move to the next one for a second, please. Thank you. So I've already touched upon this, what we refer to as the HITRUST approach. It's that combination of the comprehensive framework, again, scalable with the level of prescription, and also tailors to your organization to allow you to assess one's report many. That assurance program that's rooted in the assessment methodology provides you that level of independent assurance and 5 different levels of quality assurance review as part of your third-party assurance report, which is above and beyond any others that exist within the marketplace. All can be facilitated by the HITRUST MyCSF platform, but not required. So I like to refer to it as the 4 legs of the stool: the framework, the assessment methodology, the assurance program, and then, of course, the platform to help you facilitate that to the extent that you'd like to leverage that. And the next slide, Jill, please. A little bit about the platform. I won't spend a lot of time on this. No, it is available. And even if you don't get a subscription, you can still undergo an assessment. And that actually happens through the online portal version. So you don't get all the bells and whistles associated with an actual subscription, but you will still interact with the portal and the platform in order to undergo the assessment. And that's what Joe and Allison will use in order to move you through the process. Okay, next one. Okay, I think this is off to you guys, right?
Yes, thank you. So that was an awesome kind of baseline knowledge that Mike just gave us to kind of get us ready to where we're at now. So kind of what the organization's about, the framework and the tools that might be able to be used to assist you in doing so. So now we're going to jump into the different types of assessments you might come across that is best for your scenario and your organization. So for an organization wanting to assess controls to better understand and manage their risk exposure, the readiness option is a practical option of achieving this through an accepted approach. So organizations can perform a baseline but comprehensive control assessment using this option and the CSF tool and receive a readiness assessment report from HITRUST. So for this readiness option, the organization will enter risk factors into the MyCSF, respond to all the requirement statements, and submit the completed questionnaire to HITRUST for review and that report generation. So your organization will engage HITRUST directly to finish that process. You do not need an external assessor firm. And a readiness report is intended to be used to really evaluate how closely an organization's control environment aligns to the HITRUST CSF, and it can be used as a stepping stone towards the next type I have here, which is the validated. Quickly before I covered that piece, I did just want to mention, and Mike covered it pretty well, but I mentioned the term external assessor or external assessor firm. And for clarification, those are the certified CSF practitioners Mike mentioned, where they're certified through HITRUST and are those qualified to perform the validation component. And the individual practitioners are then part of an assessor firm who also have to meet certain stipulations. So they have completed the HITRUST training and act as an arm or an extension of HITRUST, and they're the ones out in the field doing the validations and being that connection from the client and HITRUST. So I just wanted to clarify that. So this next one here, validated assessment, a lot of times we'll hear, and maybe Mike has heard the same thing, when someone says they would like to get HITRUST certified, this option is actually going for a HITRUST validated report, which is the first step towards that certification. So a validated assessment may or may not meet certification requirements. So the assessment may result in a validated report only, or you can get that validated report with certification if you meet the certain thresholds on your maturity and scoring levels. This is why it is important, and Mike talked on this, to perform some type of readiness or gap assessment prior, whether it's the readiness assessment where you want to get your report or a more general one you're doing internally or with a consultant. That way, when you do go for validation and take the time, resources, money, you know you're set and ready to go and have a good chance of passing that report option. Similar to that of the readiness, the client will respond to control requirement statements, but then the difference is the client submits the completed questionnaire to the external assessor, and they complete the validation work. So the assessor completes testing and validation according to the HITRUST guidelines, which has to do with how we will score things, the timeline that's required, and different sample sizes, for example. So this needs to be finalized and submitted by an assessor firm to HITRUST for HITRUST review. As Mike said, they go over what the assessors do out in the field, and all that is done within 90 days. So you, as the client who is going for HITRUST, and the assessor firm have 90 days essentially once you kick it off to pass back and forth that evidence, get information filled in and scoring agreed to, evidence populated, etc., and pass that off. So it is a tight window to get it done in, especially depending on how many controls end up being in your assessment. On the next slide here, we come to targeted and customized assessments, which are two newer assessment options from HITRUST. And with the targeted assessment, you are focusing on specific authoritative sources where you can then assess those specific controls in the environment against a given regulatory factor that Mike kind of went over. It's those laws, regulations, and standards that HITRUST maps to. And that allows you to do that without performing that full, robust HITRUST assessment. And then similar to that is the customized assessments. Just noticing the slide didn't advance here. There we go. With the customized assessments, that will let an organization pick out specific requirement statements from that CSF framework to be brought into their assessment, and this will be done through the creation of a custom library. So that's just another way to organize those subsets of controls. And with these two options, they'll help organizations perform a more pinpoint assessment in given areas, either in preparation for or in addition to the items we spoke about on the last slide, the readiness and the validated, but neither result in a report or certification. So it's for your organization to assess and kind of overview of where you are on those items. Mike, I know I touched on those. Do you have anything to add as far as these newer assessment types that I might have missed?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it, Jill. The only thing I would add is, although you're not getting, as Jill mentioned, a certification report, you do get what we refer to as a scorecard. So you do have a report that you can use to show that you've done an assessment against a particular authoritative source. And that is certainly something that, you know, Jill and Allison can look at and even perform a level of validation procedures for you over that. However, again, you're not going to get the certification report because that is a combination of a number of different requirements. But know that that is available to you. I will tell you that our next gen, if you will, is working on a process where you can get a validated targeted assessment. That is something that we have in process right now. So you will be able to get a report. You know, in some instances, it may be a quote-unquote certification or really a certification around the implementation of controls that addresses that specific targeted authoritative source, very similar to what we do with NIST today. You know, every organization that undergoes a HITRUST certification also gets a NIST cybersecurity framework certification. But as we know, there's no such thing as a NIST certification, just like there's no such thing as a HIPAA certification. So the way that we structure that is a certification over the implementation of controls that meet the standard. And that's what we're looking to do for all the targeted assessments going forward. The other thing I'd like to note, I don't think Jill did herself enough credit, but on that self-assessment process, although you are not required to use an independent assessor, we highly recommend you do to sit with you throughout that process. The earlier you get your assessor involved, the better, right? We're all good people. I think we have a tendency to maybe overscore ourselves and maybe think that we're doing a little better than we are. So having somebody objective at the table with you is super helpful, because the last thing that you want to do is go it alone. Then you call Jill and Alice and say, come in and help me. And they say, you guys totally missed the boat on this, right? So the earlier you get them involved, the better it is for you and the easier it is for them, because if they're with you throughout the journey of the readiness process, they're already familiar with your environment. There's probably a lot of things that they can leverage and go through the validation process much quicker. So that's all I would add, Jill.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. And yeah, that's a good point. We've come into organizations at many different points, and like Mike's referring to, sometimes it's going smoother than others, but I will say a lot of times when we come in, some organizations we've worked with, they were working on this for over a year or two and just couldn't get there. They have their day jobs, they didn't have the right buy-in, etc. So Allison's going to talk later on the timeline, but I do think having that extra hand to kind of do the project management and guide you through from their own experience and our knowledge does help reduce the time to get ready for validation or, the report types you're looking for. So I will throw that out there just from our experience with our clients. The next thing we want to talk about is scoping of those assessments. So now that we have the types of assessment options down, we'll kind of cover the information you'll need to know as you go through scoping of an assessment. And Mike mentioned a lot of this is right within the portal for you when you're leveraging that, and you'll kind of be walked through them, but we'll kind of go through some of it here. So the following information helps HITRUST generate report details. So when a report is provided to your organization and you choose to hand that off to who is asking for it, etc. It'll have a lot of your organization background within it. This information not only provides that detailed information, the background, but it also helps populate your object. And when I say object, that's just another word for the scope environment. So that can include one or many items, systems, processes, facilities, etc. So this information typically will cover the items I have on the screen. It starts with high-level organization information for background, including contact information, your location, a summary of your organization, how many employees, etc. And then you'll be asked to select the assessment type and what areas you want covered in the framework, which revolve around security and privacy options. At this time, if going for validated, you'll also be presented with the assessor firm list that HITRUST has approved, and that's where you can select the firm you engage with to perform that validation work. It will then go on to ask about the systems and facilities that are in scope, and this helps define the systems where the systems, the related processes, and the personnel reside. So oftentimes you will have both your organization location or multiple locations, depending on how many offices are within the scope, as well as, say, co-location and third-party facilities, for example. So all that needs to be kept in mind. You will then come to the factor section, which really drives how your assessment will be populated and with what controls. As Mike said, there's a lot out there, and it's going to use these items to kind of hone in on what's specific to your organization. So what we have on the slide here is a condensed version of the questions and information you'll be asked. But to give you an idea, it will touch upon items such as number of records held, depending on how you define that. Are you operating within a single state? Do you operate across multiple states or even internationally? It then gets into some system factors, including access. How do individuals access it? Can third parties access it? Do they do this via a public connection on mobile devices? Are those mobile devices bring your own or owned by the organization? That type of thing. And then it further goes to items such as interfaces to other systems, number of users, transactions, etc. So that gives you a feel for what's out there, and there's a handful of other items you'll have to touch upon as well. The last item here, regulatory factors, which we already covered slightly, are those optional additional topics that can be included in the assessment and will most often increase the control count. So as you can see on the next slide here, this is a screenshot from within the portal that gives you an idea of those regulatory factors you can add. And over the years, HITRUST has been able to map the CSF framework to many laws, regulations, and standards, as Mike was saying, to help organizations complete a single assessment that covers many common areas that are in need of assessing or even auditing for risk purposes and oftentimes required by some of these items listed here. So as you can see over time, not only do they have items that touch on state level, but they also go to international and now into other industries. Mike mentioned this started in healthcare, but has gone far into other industries at this point. So it has a lot of good coverage and mapping. This is another reason you'll want to definitely know why you're using the HITRUST framework and what's driving the need, because if you do have room for these additional options, it may save you repetitive work and other assessment and audits elsewhere. On the next slide, just quick, I know we're not going too deep into things, but I do want to mention the CSF categories and domains. So the control count for each of your assessments are going to vary widely because it's specific to you, but no matter the assessment type, the factors or the scope, the things we've gone over here, all of your controls will come from these 14 categories, 0 through 13, on the left hand of the slide here. And those items get mapped and fall into 19 domains that controls get organized in. So that way you have a common organization of controls come assessment time. So this is kind of, as you read through the items here, I'm sure a lot of titles and topics that you see throughout many IT security and privacy audits and assessments. And similarly here, we have them mapped and organized so you can, have control owners internally, and when the assessment's being done, these are the categories you get broken up into and kind of graded against. So what we just covered will give you the information you need to not only pick the right assessment for your current situation, as well as the type of data you'll need to know about the environment and scope to get an object created and to begin working. So whether that's finding the gaps and performing remediation before you go to validation, or being ready to fill in the controls to be provided to the assessor firm for validation, you kind of have that background. But now I'm going to pass it off to Allison, who will help explain what many organizations are interested in when we talk with them, which is how long do these steps usually take? Allison?
Thanks, Jill. So now let's talk on the timelines on that next slide. Yep. So for organizations undergoing a HITRUST assessment for the first time, like Jill mentioned, the preparation time can vary depending on the size and complexity of the organization and, of course, that scoped environment. This process is typically about 3 months to a year, but it really varies widely due to management buy-in and dedication to resources. So once the organization has completed their initial assessment, it's then resubmitted to the CSF assessor that the organization has selected, and that's when that 90-day clock begins. And during these 90 days, that's when the assessor will be performing their testing validation against the organization control scores and the responses. Once the assessor has completed their testing, it's then going to be submitted to HITRUST. HITRUST, they perform their QA work, and this is typically about an 8 to 10 week process. And once completed, the draft report will be available. So once you receive that draft report, you'll have 30 days to review it and provide corrective action plan responses back to HITRUST. And just as a note, as you're beginning planning your work and timing, it is a good idea to consider and keep in mind any upcoming HITRUST CSF version changes. Depending on when a new version is released, it could require you to switch over to that newer version after a given period of time. So it's really just something to always keep in mind. But if you do go through the validation and end up getting your certification, here are some items to keep in mind on the next slide. Yep. So first, the certification, it's valid for 2 years. During this time, organizations, they can share either their full report or just the certification letter. This typically just depends on how much information the organization is comfortable sharing and, of course, what is being requested of them. There will be a NIST report, and that's generated from HITRUST, and that can be handed out as well. And so while the certification is valid for 2 years, an interim assessment is required to be performed after the first year. And this assessment, it must be submitted to HITRUST by the 1-year anniversary date. The interim assessment, it will need to be completed by a CSF assessor firm, and it'll include a review of one control from each of those 19 domains and a review of all CAPs to validate that progress on CAPs has been made. And just as a note during this process, HITRUST, they do have the right to request additional controls to be tested and or possibly removal of certification if there are large enough changes to the environment or if they feel that satisfactory progress has not been made. And now we're going to talk on some version 10 considerations. Yep. So we want to take some time to mention that the next scheduled release of the HITRUST CSF version is going to be version 10. So with this release, the overall validation procedure or scoring model won't be changing, but there are a couple changes on this slide to note. The first is that certification will no longer be based on a subset of the HITRUST CSF control references, and instead focus will be on the control core. This core will contain most of the HITRUST CSF requirements that commonly apply to any organization type. And then you can see here in the chart some of the differences between the 9.0 versions and the upcoming version 10. The first is that there's an increase in control categories. You can see going from 14 to 16. But then you can see the decrease in both the control objectives and control references. And then lastly there you can see that with the version 10 that it was updated based on the ISO 2013 framework, where before it was based on the 2005 framework. The goal of this was really just to make it easier for non-healthcare entities to adopt the HITRUST CSF. So these are really just some of the items we'll be looking for in the upcoming months. But now I will let Mike touch on some of the competitive advantages of using HITRUST.
Great, thanks, Allison. And just to comment on V10, those are the highlights that Allison walked you through. We've got a lot more information and communication that's going to be coming out. I know a lot of people are nervous. Don't get nervous. It's going to be okay. It's not a significant emotional event. And we're in the process of packaging that together. So we're naturally going to share that with our assessor community first, right? So Jill and Allison will be able to see that before you guys do, just to get their feedback and make sure we've got the messaging appropriate on our side. But you're going to get a lot more information around that. And I think we're going to be doing a couple webinars and some office hours around it as well. I think as Allison mentioned, the whole focus of the next version update is to make it easier for you guys and also for our assessors. There's some quirky things that exist right now within the framework, right? Like there's some duplicative requirements that may appear 20 different times that you got to respond to 20 different times. Well, that doesn't make any sense. How do I respond to it once and then point to where it's relevant? Some of the wording is certainly not as clear when you look at some of the procedures, so we're in the process of clarifying that. And then also on the scoping factors that Jill was walking you through, some of those can be subject to a lot of interpretation or hard to figure out. So we're providing some more case studies and use cases around that to help organizations answer some common questions that come up around things like, well, is my application accessible from the internet, right? And what do I do with wireless networks? Is that applicable? Is that not applicable? So some of the common things that we see to provide some more clarity. Another thing I want to note that we certainly don't want to forget about is, and you saw this in one of the domain requirements, is third-party risk management. Right? So we don't allow for carve-outs in our assessment report by design, unlike other reports like SOC reports where you could say, oh, a vendor does this, so we don't care, go talk to them. We don't allow that. We believe that organizations that are leveraging our assurance reports need to have a full picture into the risk. So therefore, you'll notice one of the domains is that you must have an effective third-party risk management program in place in order to achieve the certification. But we got to make sure you're doing your diligence around your third parties. So let's not forget about that, because that's a huge piece into this. As we all know, we've all got third parties that we're working with that are dependent upon a lot of the services that we are providing to our customers. These are just some testimonials and some examples. Oftentimes I'll get the question of, well, why make this investment? There's a lot of reasons why. I think first and foremost, as you heard all of us say so far today, is by making it takes money to make money, right? So by making the investment to undergo a comprehensive assessment, how do you make money in terms of cost savings, right? By reducing maybe other assessments that you're doing and certainly reducing the time and effort that's being spent on all these proprietary questionnaires and on-site audits. That's probably the greatest advantage, but it also provides you a competitive advantage. There are many organizations that require HITRUST certification. You can't do business unless you have it, right? So the pure barriers to entry that exist that you can break down. We have documented cases of organizations that have used their HITRUST certification to get a reduction in cybersecurity insurance premiums, right? Some of them up to 50%, if you will, on a year-in-year basis. There's some hospital systems that do a HITRUST certification just for that reason, right? They don't have necessarily other stakeholders that they need to provide this to, but they use it in order to reduce their cybersecurity insurance premiums. If you think about it through the lens of maybe a startup organization, a disruptor, an innovator that's out there trying to get traction with their services, some of them, their revenue can increase significantly overnight, right, just by achieving a certification, because it opens the door for more organizations, and it shows a badge of good security and privacy posture and transparency into the programs. And this concept of using good security and privacy posture as a differentiator in the marketplace is gaining a lot of traction, especially in today's day and age. where maybe, before it was, well, who's the cost leader or who's the biggest differentiator relative to the quality of the product? And now we're seeing a movement toward who's protecting data the best, right, as a differentiator in terms of who somebody's going to work with. So just some things to consider. We've got a bunch of use cases and examples around, quote unquote, justifying the assessment. And then on to the next one, I think, Jill.
Yep.
Okay, so that's back to you. I don't think my contact info is on here, but Jill and Allison have my contact info. So anybody that is interested or wants to learn more on some of the things I talked about today, you could certainly reach out to them. And I will mention on that third-party risk management front, we have a third-party risk management program that you can leverage as well that will help you with those requirements that exist within the framework that effectively generates evidence that Jill and Allison can use in support of your assessment as they're going through that process. So anybody that wants to learn more about that, just let us know, and I'm more than happy to give you some information.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So now that we've provided an overview on the foundational information and benefits of HITRUST, you might have some questions on either what we went over or just some general questions on your own HITRUST journey. Please feel free to reach out to us on anything we can assist with. You can see mine and Jill's contact information is here on the slide, and we would be happy to help. We have experience working with clients at all stages, whether it's from consulting with readiness reports through validation and then the interim assessments. And we do know that this can be a large undertaking, and it really can be helpful to have someone on your team who's dedicated, has experience, and can just take the burden off of some of your internal resources. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to any of us.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Allison. And we do look forward to hearing from any of you on the call who may need assistance in any capacity. And we're almost out of time here, but I did just want to go over one question while we have Mike as a resource here. Mike, would you be able to provide some insight on the new information? I feel like a hot topic we're seeing with our clients is the CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and the DoD. And can you kind of give us a little insight on how that may play into the HITRUST approach in the future here?
Yeah, it's a great question that came from the group. So obviously that's hot right now for those individuals or organizations that are not familiar with that is. So the CMMC is going to be a new standard for really any DoD contractor or even subcontractors, right? And it's focused on the supply chain associated with DoD. There's been a requirement in place for some time now where organizations were required to perform a self-assessment against the CMMC standards, which is effectively NIST 800-171 is really what it is, and provide that to the DoD on an annual basis. They've recently changed that requirement, and starting in January of 2021, organizations will now have to provide the equivalent of a validated assessment. So it needs to be an audited report against that standard. They're no longer going to accept a self-assessment. And that will need to be performed by specific organizations that they approve, very similar to our assessors, many of which our assessors have already applied, some of which have already been approved to do that work. So you see the synergy and the crossover here. So what we have done, we actually sit on, there's 5 different working groups from a CMMC standpoint. We sit on 3 and chair 2. And we've been working with the organization and the consortium and the DoD directly to say, guys, don't recreate the wheel. Don't go create yet something else that organizations have to do. Look at what we already have, and let's figure out if this meets the requirements and the standards that you're trying to put in place. And it's been nothing but thumbs up so far. Now, naturally, we're working with the government. Nothing is finalized yet. As we know, it takes a lot of time. But what we have done to get in front of this is all the requirements for CMMC have now been included within the framework. So 800-171 is included within there. There is an overlay and a specific authoritative source that you can select to say subject to CMMC in order to get those requirements in. We've also established a formal readiness program where you can leverage the CSF, even if you're just doing one of those targeted assessments that Jill was mentioned before. for a readiness assessment against CMMC, so you can see where you stand, because you don't want to wait, right? We're already at, let's see, September 30th. Who knows if this thing is going to be delayed or not, but I would highly recommend you do some type of readiness assessment now, and you can leverage the CSF in order to do that. And you can certainly work with an assessor organization to help you get a thumbs up on that. So we've got a whole website and a whole program. We're actually in the process of standing up our first webinar to walk through that program. It looks like it's going to be probably the last week of October, so you can monitor our communication on our website for more information on that. But we're trying to do it in the Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we will be joined by the CMMC that will be talking through the program ourselves and in a position to answer any questions that organizations may have.
Great, that's great information. I think we'll all be looking forward to that. I know it's been a very hot topic for us, so thanks, Mike. And we're coming up right at the end of the hour here, so it's about all the time we have today, but if anyone thinks of anything that we didn't cover today or any additional questions for ourselves, or if you'd like us to get you in touch with Mike once we're finished here today, please do not hesitate to reach out. We'd be glad to help you on whatever that is. And we definitely thank Mike for his time and greatly appreciate him joining us today as well. So thank you all for joining and have a great rest of your day.